Hey everybody, this is Rykard here again, and welcome to the first episode in my guide to team building in Pokemon. Now, if you are familiar with any of the other educational series that I've done on my channel, you'll know that this is basically going to be a multi-parted series with which I discuss the various things that I like to think about and consider when building a team in any sort of competitive Pokemon environment. And this is a guide that will apply to all tiers and also all generations of Pokemon, whether it be 1st gen through 5th gen and eventually 6th when that comes out later this year. But anyways, for the first episode, I figured the best thing to do would be to start off by talking about the things that pretty much every team should have or consider when building one, and also what I refer to as the basic team model, which is basically a guide that I tend to go by when it comes to selecting the various members of my team and the roles that they are going to have. So first, let's start off by taking a look at basically a few things that I've come up with that I feel like all teams should have or consider having when you are making them. So the first thing that I think all teams should include is a variety of different Pokemon types. And this pretty much goes without saying because if you do have a ton of Pokemon that are the same type, that means you're also going to have a lot of Pokemon that have the same weaknesses, which is never a good thing. So you want to find a good balance of Pokemon types so that it is very difficult for your opponent to hit the same thing for super effective damage, which I'll talk a little bit more in depth on in a second. But as for you, from a more offensive standpoint, you really want to have good type coverage from both the physical and special sides so that you can hit your opponent for super effective damage pretty easily and usually or hopefully against their weaker defense in the case of like the walls that you might be facing. So what you want to do is just basically make sure that you have a variety of different attacking types on your team and also a variety of different Pokemon that can hit from both the physical and special side. As for the next thing that I think is possibly one of the most important things is that you want to have a multitude of type resistances and immunities so that you're able to easily handle anything your opponent wants to throw at you. With this, basically you should be able to handle any type of attack, and I mean any type, and you should be able to do that with a resistance. Similarly, you also want to have a minimal amount of type weaknesses, and this goes without saying that you should not have at least more than 2 things weak to the same type on your team, because otherwise that is a serious problem and a hole in your team that your opponent can exploit. Similarly, you don't want to have a lot of Pokemon that are weak to a lot of types. So you want to try and minimize that as much as possible to make your team much more difficult to deal with from your opponent's standpoint. Also, for more specific things that I think are very important, you do want to have a way for your team to deal with baton pass, because this is something that can be very dangerous when you face it, but it's something that can be it's something that can be stopped very easily with having a Pokemon with Roar or something like that, or Dragon Tail, or pretty much any phasing move. Also, it's really easy to just have a Pokemon that will just kill the baton passer outright so that you won't have to deal with it passing things to your opponent's teammates. And obviously, one of the main Pokemon that you want to be considering to deal with in this case is Ninjask. Another thing that is very important is you should have a way to deal with entry hazards. And this can be done in a variety of different ways. The most obvious and immediate way being having a rapid spinner, but the other thing could just be having a poison type that will be able to absorb toxic spikes, or just having a team in general that just isn't really affected by them. So that would be like Pokemon having Magic Guard, or Pokemon having Levitate so that they're not weak to spikes, or just having Pokemon that resist Stealth Rock in general. Because entry hazard damage can rack up the longer the battle goes on, and it can be very dangerous for you to have to deal with your Pokemon taking a significant amount of damage every time they switch in. And then the last thing that I think is very important is just synergy between all your teammates. You want them to be able to support each other very easily, and you want them to also be able to handle certain Pokemon that maybe other Pokemon on your team are not able to handle as easily. So you want them to be able to basically take out the threats that your opponent has, and also take the hits from your opponent's threats so that you're able to survive throughout the battle and not lose your Pokemon very fast. But with that, let's take a look at Rykard, aka me, my basic model for team building. So with 6 Pokemon, it's often very difficult to figure out what each of them should do. So this is basically the model that I go by when I consider making a team and how I structure each set for each team member on the team. So the first thing that I always think about is the defensive core. And this is basically the Pokemon on your team that are going to be the ones that need to take hits because your opponent obviously is going to be wanting to do damage to you. So the first thing that you should always have, in my opinion, is a physical wall to basically take physical hits from your opponent. With that, you should also have a special wall to take special hits, and then a more balanced wall that can take hits from both the physical and special side if possible. Now, obviously, and I will go more into depth on this in the next part, but these 3 Pokemon should have good type synergy with each other, meaning that if one of them is weak to something, the other should be able to resist it. So that you basically can have a functioning trio of wallers that can handle any type of attack that your opponent wants to throw out at you. Another typical thing as well with the walls of the defensive core is that one of them usually has a move to set up entry hazards, whether it be spikes or stealth rock. Also, some of the walls typically are rapid spinners or things like that, but I just wanted to make sure that you all knew that if you are using walls, it's always good to have one that can set up entry hazards or have some other kind of support move to help your team out, like Heal Bell or Aromatherapy or something like that, or even Wish to pass to your other teammates. As for the offensive side, obviously, similarly to the walls, you want to have a very powerful physical attacker, a powerful special attacker, and a setup Pokemon that is able to basically boost its stats if given the opportunity to, and sweep. Again, I will be going more in depth on this in a later episode, but it also is important, at least from my standpoint, to point out that one of these is typically choice scarfed, so that you're able to outspeed the majority of Pokemon on your team and or your opponent's team and revenge kill as necessary. Obviously, one of the Pokemon does not have to be, but it is usually beneficial if one of them is, so that you know that it can be very fast. And I will obviously talk more about characteristics of these offensive threats later in another part. But that is pretty much the model I go by. Obviously, there are different ways to go about it, but I think this is very solid or a very solid basis for building a team so that you can make it pretty balanced from both the defensive and offensive side, be able to handle any threats your opponent has, and also threaten your opponent with your offensive Pokemon. So to introduce the team that I'm going to be basically using throughout the series of videos, it's an NU team that I made a little while back that I found to be incredibly effective in that tier. Obviously, the model I'm going to be talking about is useful for all tiers, but this is just a team that I thought was very well designed and can handle a lot of things in that tier and also basically be very threatening to a lot of other things in the tier that your opponent might have. So the first thing on this team is a Wormadam with the Sandy Cloak to make it a ground bug type. Then we have a Licky Licky and a Lumineon, which those 3 Pokemon make up the defensive core of my team. Then with that, I have a Raichu, a Skuntank, and a Duosion, which make up the offensive portion of my team. So you'll get to know this team very well in the coming episodes, but I just wanted to introduce that now and basically give you an idea of the kind of things I'm going to be talking about in the future episodes. So with that, that is basically the intro to the series. So I hope you enjoyed and you learned a little bit about at least how I go about building a team and the things that you should always consider when making one of your own. So that is it for this video, everyone. So as always, take care, goodbye, and I will see you next time in my next part where I talk about the roles of the defensive core on each team.